Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, stripped of personal rights, has appeared in many forms throughout world history. But one institution stands out, both for its global scale and its lasting legacy. The numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. Sometime between 1500 and 1880 CE, an estimated 10 to 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, and around 15% of those people perished during the voyage. Most enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. Around 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic to many different destinations. Once in the Americas, the survivors were sold at markets very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks. Again, just as they would do with cattle, the lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror. The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse, nothing. The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans who were forced out of their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain began conquering and establishing colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations. However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many Indian slaves, creating a labor shortage in Europe and turning European eyes toward Africa for a solution. As voyages to Africa progressed, with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of slave supply to Europe. The Spanish West Indies and the Portuguese colonies in Brazil. Gradually, Indian slaves were replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect because before being captured by Europeans, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and much more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and heritage. But when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives, forced aboard large ships, and taken to Europe. European slavers dispersed them across the Americas and different parts of Europe, where they were forced to live under terrible conditions and face severe labor. Stripped, flogged, forced to work very long hours, often in terrible weather and poor health. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 and 12 million enslaved black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade, although suffering economically, while the other 2 parts of the triangle enjoyed huge benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But even before that, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa, not out of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and would corrupt European society, introducing pagan and non-Christian practices. However, over the years, for economic reasons, that decision was reversed. On August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Goravod to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents and permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa, on the condition that they be converted to Christianity during the voyage across the Atlantic. With this new decree, the number of slaves moved from Africa to America exploded. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast, then brought them to the Americas. Generally, European slave traders did not participate in the raids themselves. Their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to widespread malaria, so the majority of people transported in the transatlantic slave trade were Central and West Africans captured by other West Africans and sold to Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route, and European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now let's dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. Simply put, it was the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This route took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of those goods included arms, textiles, and wine. On another side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The final side was the movement of raw materials, sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton, produced on American plantations back to Europe. The triangle involved 3 continents, Europe providing the capital, Africa providing the labor, and America providing the land and resources. There was always a supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade involves the story of all people on the 3 continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. This voyage was often marked by great difficulty and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that ships lost not only the enslaved people but also, in some cases, crew members. The mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions were inhumane. African slaves were locked below the deck in cramped quarters, with little opportunity to see sunlight, forced to carry out certain exercises, in the form of dancing, to ensure they remained healthy and in good posture upon arrival in Europe. Inside those decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt, feces, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches of space. A woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. Girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excrement. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst, receiving only 24 ounces of water per day, the equivalent of 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their main food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks and chained together, hands and feet. The voyage was characterized by many difficulties: epidemic diseases, attacks by pirates, and physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage. The conditions were so severe that only a tiny percentage of transported Africans came directly to North America. Just about 4% of the total, no more than 400,000. The vast majority were sent to the Caribbean and South America, Almost half of all slaves captured and transported from Africa, about 5 million, were sent to Brazil. I know you'll be wondering, how could thousands of slaves not overpower hundreds of crewmen? Well, there was one famous situation where African slaves revolted and took over their ship. The details of that story are as chilling as they are fascinating. We'll get to that shortly. But keep in mind that slave traders were armed and typically kept the slaves in chains before transport. Anyway, let's finish up on the journey and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. And while we might think that all slaves transported out of Africa came via the transatlantic route, that's not entirely true. The transatlantic slave trade made up only half of the total slaves traded and transported from Africa. It's reported that from AD 650 to 1900, Islamic traders were also exporting slaves from Africa, sending a total of 10 million slaves to Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq, transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Some slaves were also enslaved but remained in Africa. Many of the slaves captured in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. The slave activity there was so excessive that the section of the African coast in countries like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria was even called the Slave Coast. A majority of slaves were taken from West Central Africa. In the early stages, the Portuguese generally took Africans captured during tribal wars. But as demand increased, the Portuguese began entering the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. In the 1690s, the number of people taken from Africa yearly reached about 30,000. A century later, that number grew to about 85,000 per year. During the 1700s and into 1850, it's estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans forced into the slave trade successfully crossed the Atlantic. Between 1821 and 1830, about 80,000 people were leaving Africa yearly. Within the next 20 years before abolition, over 1 million more Africans were sent across the Atlantic to America. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. Africans sent to Brazil were mostly from Angola. Those transported to North America, including the Caribbean, were taken mainly from West Africa. Although only about 6% of African captives were sent to British North America, by 1825 the U.S. population included about 1/4 of all people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, the condition of slavery in America was totally different from that in the U.S. But before we dive into those mind-boggling details, let's talk about the revolt of 1839. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. The revolt of 1839. In 1839, slave traders were once again hoping to get another shipment of slaves across the Atlantic. But unlike previous voyages, they were not ready for the surprise this particular voyage would bring. The slave ship, named the Amistad, had about 100 slaves on board. As the ship moved near the coast of Cuba, the unwilling passengers, recently abducted from Africa, numbering about 53, revolted aggressively. The revolters, led by Joseph Cinqué, killed the captain and cook, sparing only the life of the Spanish navigator, so he could sail them home back to Sierra Leone. However, the navigator managed to sail the Amistad northward. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy intercepted and seized the ship off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut, and the mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut. This event had significant political and legal repercussions for the American abolition movement at the time. The Spanish embassy demanded that the African slaves be returned to Cuba, leading to the 1840 trial in Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Louis Tappan was successful in drawing public sympathy to the Africans and battled the pro-slavery U.S. government. However, President Martin Van Buren ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. The interesting part was the legal proceeding that ensued. Prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to laws governing conduct between slaves and masters. And here's where it gets interesting. Trial testimony showed that while slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. The judge, therefore, ruled that the Africans were not merchandise, but victims of kidnapping, and thus had the right to escape their captors in any way they could. When the U.S. government appealed the case before the U.S. Supreme Court the following year, former President John Quincy Adams won the court's ruling in favor of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's judgment. Through contributions from private and missionary societies, the 35 surviving Africans secured passage home, arriving in Sierra Leone in January 1842, alongside 5 missionaries and teachers who later founded a Christian mission in the country. African involvement DOS. While we can definitely blame Europeans for the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were also involved in slave trade activities. Africans participated in kidnapping adults and stealing children for sale, using European intermediaries or agents to sell captives in exchange for merchandise or arms. In most cases, those sold into slavery were from a different ethnic group than those who captured them. It didn't matter if they were enemies or indigenous people of a neighboring village. Captive slaves were stripped of any identity and simply referred to as other. They were not seen as part of the people of that ethnic group or tribe. Also, while African kings were very interested in protecting their villages, in some instances thieves and criminals were sold into slavery as a way to get rid of them. Many other slaves were obtained through gunpoint raids, organized by different ethnic groups, sometimes as a joint venture with Europeans. Recorded in the book, Daughters of the Transatlantic Slavers and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast, author Pernille Ibsen shared that Africans on the Gold Coast, present day Ghana, also participated in the slave trade through intermarriage. The term used was casari, derived from Portuguese, meaning to marry, used to form political bonds and economic connections between slave traders and Europeans. In the initial stages, it was common for powerful West African families to marry off their women to European traders in alliance, further enforcing the syndicate. While the marriages had to be performed according to African customs, the Europeans offered no objection, fully aware of how vital these connections were to business success. In the initial stages, we might argue that Africans had no idea of the exact conditions of the slave trade or the experience of those sold into it. However, according to Robin Law, there's a possibility that the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom must have had an informed understanding of the fates of Africans sold into slavery, because the King of Dahomey sent diplomats to Brazil and Portugal, who returned with information, and some elites of Dahomey had experienced slavery in America before returning home. So the only opposition the Kingdom of Dahomey had against slavery was the law prohibiting enslavement of a fellow Dahomean. Anyone caught doing so faced the death penalty. While the kingdom opposed that, they had no issue with the institution of slavery itself. The case was different on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. There, elites sent their kids to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans, sailing with them and living inside their forts. Some even sent their children to Europe and America to be educated. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with Dutch and British governments to rescue some of their friends who were tricked into slavery in America. However, a common assumption among many Africans unaware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned to cook and eat their captives. This rumor made the experience even more distressing for captives locked in ships, sailing to Europe. Death and destruction. The transatlantic slave trade led to an uncountable loss of life, both for captives inside and outside America. A BBC report indicated that more than 1 million people are thought to have died during transport to the New World. More died soon after arrival due to terrible health conditions. Although the number of slaves who died after being bought is unclear, one thing is certain: this number may exceed the number of those who survived to be enslaved. The Atlantic slave trade led to the destruction of lives and cultures. It's estimated that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, and about 1.5 million died on board slave ships. Apart from those who died in the Middle Passage, many Africans were also killed during slave raids and wars in Africa. Canadian scholar Adam Jones has characterized the deaths of millions of Africans in this period as a genocide, calling it one of the worst holocausts in human history. Many believe these deaths were not intentional, that it was in slave owners' interest to keep slaves alive, not exterminate them. Jones argues that the killing and destruction were intentional. Whatever the incentives to preserve survivors of the Atlantic Passage for labor exploitation. He writes, to revisit the issue of intent already touched on, if an institution is deliberately maintained and expanded by discernible agents. Though all are aware of the horrendous casualties it is inflicting on a definable human group, then why should this not qualify as genocide? Saidiya Hartman, an American writer and academic focusing on African-American studies, argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to the acquisition of profit and the rise of capitalism. She argues that death wasn't a goal in itself, but just a byproduct of commerce, which has the lasting effect of making negligible all the millions of lives lost. Incidental death occurs when life has no normative value, when no humans are involved, when the population is in effect seen as already dead. Hartman goes on to say that although unlike the concentration camp or the Gulag, the Atlantic slave trade also led to millions of corpses. In this case, extermination was not the major goal, but a major corollary to the making of commodities. Who do we blame? While we can blame the Germans for the genocide attempt on the Jews, who do we blame for this slave trade? 7 nations were actively involved and took most of the slaves to their colonies in the New World: the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Americans, and the Danish. The major sources of slaves included the Angola coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa and Indian Ocean Islands, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also affected how the legal code in Africa worked. According to Kamboni Nyusi, many African societies changed the punishment for certain crimes and how they responded to offenders. Some crimes traditionally punishable by other forms of punishment became punishable by enslavement, and offenders were sold to slave traders. David Stannard, author of American Holocaust, showed in his book that 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms. Wars that produced the majority of slaves. The practice of enslaving enemy combatants and their villages was widely practiced in West Africa. Indeed, the slave trade was largely a byproduct of tribal and state warfare. By selling off captives, they financed future warfare and removed potential dissidents after victory. However, some African nations, such as Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Oron Confederacy, were more brutal in this practice. Truly, Africans were fully involved in the slave trade and aided it in many ways. But we can't take away the fact that Europeans provided the incentives that made this activity thrive. In one of the letters written by King Nzinga Mbemba Afonso of Congo to King João Aperturi of Portugal, he requests that the king stop sending merchandise that fuels war between different tribes. He begs the king to send more missionaries instead. In one letter, he writes, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and schoolteachers, and no merchandise unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust over Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them after having taken these prisoners to the coast secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron. Das has apologies in remembrance. Despite the vast consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, there have been worldwide apologies from nations that benefited and grew their economies on slave labor. In 1998, UNESCO designated August 23 as the International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. This led to several other events recognizing the adverse effects of slavery on the African continent. In 2001, during the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded a clear apology for slavery from former slave trading countries. Some nations were ready to apologize, but opposing countries, mainly the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, blocked any attempt to do so. The reason for this opposition could be concerns that accepting their involvement would require monetary compensation. To affected African nations, since 2009, there has been a continuous effort by the UN to create the UN Slavery Memorial as a permanent remembrance of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. This video was crazy. But if you want to learn some more Black history that they never taught us in school, click the link on the screen. It's a story I'm sure you don't want to miss. We'll see you over there.